The clinking of silverware on porcelain was the gentle heartbeat of Aurelia, a sound as familiar to Isabella as her own breath. For 2 years, she had moved through the labyrinth of linen-draped tables, a silent dancer in a black apron, balancing trays of seared scallops and decanters of vintage Bordeaux. She was a ghost in the grand theatre of New York's elite, her purpose to be efficient, pleasant, and above all, invisible. Tonight, the air was thick with the scent of truffle oil and entitlement, clinging heavily to the velvet curtains. Isabella was serving table 7, the prime alcove overlooking the park, occupied by a man whose presence seemed to suck the very air from the room. Alistair Finch. The name was whispered among the staff with a mixture of awe and terror. A tech billionaire, a titan of industry, a man who bought and sold companies with the same casual indifference he used to order his steak. Bloody. He was impeccably dressed in a Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than her entire year's tuition at NYU, where she studied art history by day. He treated her not as a person, but as a malfunctioning piece of furniture. He snapped his fingers for water. He sent back a perfectly cooked risotto because the mood had struck him. He spoke to his dinner companion, a woman draped in diamonds and boredom, as if Isabella were deaf and dumb. Isabella endured it with the practiced smile and quiet dignity that was her armor. It was just a job, a means to an end, a way to pay for her small apartment and her dreams of one day curating a museum instead of a menu. The evening was winding down, the espresso had been served, the check presented in its leather billfold. Alistair Finch had signed it with a flourish, leaving a tip that was an insult wrapped in a pittance. Isabella cleared the last of the dessert plates, her mind already on the long subway ride home and the chapter on Renaissance frescoes she needed to finish. Wait. The voice was sharp, a shard of glass in the soft ambience. Isabella froze, turning back to the table. Alistair Finch was standing now, his face a mask of thunderous rage. His companion looked startled, her perfectly painted lips parted in a small O of surprise. "My watch," Finch snarled, his eyes cold and grey as a winter sky, locking onto Isabella. "My Patek Philippe, it's gone." He patted his wrist, then his pockets, a pantomime of rising panic that felt utterly staged. "It was right here. I took it off to be more comfortable." Isabella's blood ran cold. "Sir, I haven't seen any watch." "Perhaps you put it in your coat pocket," she suggested, her voice barely a whisper. "My coat pocket," he scoffed, his voice rising, drawing the attention of nearby tables. "Don't play dumb with me. You were just here. You cleared the table." He took a menacing step toward her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "You, with your cheap dress and your fake smile. You saw your chance, didn't you? $250,000 watch." "No, sir, I would never," Isabella pleaded, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel the stares of the other patrons, hot and judgmental. In their world, a man like Alistair Finch was a king, and a waitress was nothing, a suspect by default. "Empty your pockets," he commanded. Humiliation washed over her, hot and suffocating. "Sir, I have nothing." "I said empty your pockets," he roared. He didn't wait for her to comply. His hand shot out, grabbing the front of her apron, yanking her forward. He began roughly patting her down, his fingers digging into her sides. "Stop! You can't do that!" she cried, trying to pull away. His face contorted with fury. And then it happened. The sound was like a whip crack, sharp and ugly, silencing the entire restaurant. His open palm connected with her cheek. The force of it snapped her head to the side, and a constellation of bright, painful stars exploded behind her eyes. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The sting on her skin was nothing compared to the searing brand of public shame. Tears welled, hot and bitter, but she refused to let them fall. "I knew it," he spat, his voice dripping with venomous triumph, though he had found nothing. "You're a thief, a common little thief. Security, manager, call the police. This gutter trash just tried to rob me." The manager, a perpetually flustered man named Mr. Dubois, scurried over, his face pale. "Mr. Finch, please let's be reasonable. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding is that you hire criminals to serve your guests," Finch bellowed, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at Isabella. Her cheek throbbed with a dull, insistent fire, a physical manifestation of her shattered dignity. She stood frozen, the eyes of every diner and staff member boring into her. She was no longer Isabella, the art student. She was the accused, the thief. "I swear, Mr. Finch, I did not take your watch," she said, her voice shaking but clear. She met his gaze directly, a flicker of defiance in her own brown eyes. "I would never steal anything." This small act of resistance seemed to enrage him further. "The little tramp has a mouth on her too," he sneered to Mr. Dubois. "Are you going to handle this, or do I need to call my lawyer and have this entire establishment shut down for harboring thieves?" The threat hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Mr. Dubois wilted. He looked at Isabella with an expression of deep pity, but his choice was already made. He was a small man, caught in the gravitational pull of a very large one. "Isabella," he said, his voice strained, "company policy dictates we have to call the authorities when a guest makes such an allegation. And we'll need to search your locker." The words were a betrayal, each one a small, sharp knife. Isabella nodded numbly, the fight draining out of her. What was the point? In a battle between a billionaire and a waitress, the verdict was written before the trial even began. Two in-house security guards, men she shared coffee with in the break room, approached her with grim, apologetic faces. They escorted her through the kitchen, past the shocked stares of the chefs and dishwashers, to the staff changing rooms. Her locker, a small metal box containing her art history textbook and a half-eaten granola bar, was opened. They rummaged through it with a detached professionalism that made her feel violated all over again. They found nothing. Of course, they found nothing. But it didn't matter. The accusation was the conviction. When the NYPD officers arrived, they treated Finch with a deference that bordered on reverence. They listened intently as he recounted his version of events, embellishing the story, painting Isabella as a cunning predator who had been watching him all night. They took his statement with somber nods. Then they turned to her. The questions were sharp, loaded, presumptuous. "Where did you hide it? Did you have an accomplice? Do you have a record?" Her denials were met with skeptical glances. They patted her down again, this time a formal, impersonal search that was somehow even more degrading than Finch's assault. They found only her apartment keys, a worn-out wallet with $27 in it, and a student ID. "We have to take you in for questioning, miss," the older officer said, his tone flat, devoid of sympathy. "But you didn't find anything," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He hit me." She pointed to the red mark blooming on her cheek. The officer glanced at Finch, who just shrugged. She became hysterical. "I acted to defend myself. She was reaching for my wallet." It was a lie, so blatant, so audacious, that Isabella was left breathless. The police officers exchanged a look. It was the look that sealed her fate. They chose to believe the man in the $1,000 suit. As they led her out in handcuffs, a quiet procession of shame through the restaurant's service entrance, she saw him. Alistair Finch stood by the valet, smug and triumphant, speaking animatedly on his phone. He glanced over as she was placed in the back of the squad car, and a small, cruel smile touched his lips. The car door slammed shut, and Isabella was plunged into the sterile darkness of the back seat, the cage separating her from the officers, a stark symbol of her new reality. The city lights smeared past the window, a beautiful, indifferent blur. She had come to this city full of hope, and now it felt like a monster intent on swallowing her whole. Unseen by them all, an old man who had been sitting alone in a darkened corner of the restaurant, nursing a single glass of grappa for 3 hours, watched the entire scene unfold. He had observed the billionaire's arrogance, the waitress's quiet grace, the slap and the unjust aftermath. His face, a roadmap of wrinkles, remained impassive. He paid his bill in cash, leaving a generous tip on the table. He walked out into the cool night air, pulled out an old nondescript flip phone, and dialed a number from memory. When the call was answered, he spoke only 5 words, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The little bird is caged." The precinct was a sterile, impersonal hell of flickering fluorescent lights and the lingering smell of disinfectant and despair. Isabella sat on a hard plastic chair in a small windowless interrogation room, the cold metal of the handcuffs a constant chilling reminder of her predicament. The hours bled into one another. Different detectives came and went, their faces blurring into a single mask of weary cynicism. They asked the same questions in slightly different ways, hoping to catch her in a lie. But she only had one story to tell: the truth. "I didn't take his watch. He accused me, he assaulted me, and now I'm here. Please, you have to believe me." "Ms. Rossi," said a detective named Miller, leaning forward, his voice a practiced, pseudo-sympathetic murmur. "Mr. Finch is a very important man. He's not the type to make things up. A Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime is not a trinket. We're talking about one of the most expensive watches in the world. People do desperate things for that kind of money." "I'm a student," she said, her voice hoarse. "I work to pay my tuition. I don't even know what a Patek, what you said, is. I just know it wasn't on the table when I cleared it." "So it just vanished into thin air," he countered, his sympathy evaporating. "Look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. You tell us where it is, maybe we can talk to the DA, get you a deal. Larceny, a few years probation. You keep quiet, and Mr. Finch is prepared to press for grand larceny in the first degree. You'll do serious time, Isabella. Your life as you know it will be over." The threat was meant to break her, but it only hardened a core of resolve she didn't know she possessed. She was being framed, bullied by a rich man who couldn't bear the thought of being wrong, and by a system designed to protect him. She lifted her chin, the tears she'd held back for so long now, burning behind her eyes. "I want a lawyer." Miller sighed, pushing himself away from the table. "Suit yourself." The door clanged shut, and she was alone again with the silence and the suffocating feeling of injustice. She thought of her father. What would he think? He had always warned her that the world outside their sheltered existence was cruel and unfair. He had wanted her to stay within the golden cage he had built, protected and safe. But she had craved normalcy. She had wanted to prove to him and to herself that she could be more than just a name, that she could make her own way on her own terms. And now, this. Her grand experiment in independence had landed her in a police interrogation room, accused of a felony. She buried her face in her cuffed hands, a single hot tear finally tracing a path down her cheek. Meanwhile, Alistair Finch was celebrating. He had returned to his penthouse apartment, a glass tower that scraped the sky. He poured himself a glass of Macallan 50, the amber liquid a perfect match for his mood of righteous victory. His lawyer, a shark named Stephen Vale, had assured him the Waitress would be charged by morning. "The press will have a field day," Vale had said over the phone. "Billionaire philanthropist Alistair Finch, victim of brazen theft by service worker. It's a great narrative. Paints you as a man of the people, frequenting restaurants, yet still a victim of the city's underbelly. We can spin this." Finch swirled the scotch in his glass, a smug smile playing on his lips. He didn't care about the narrative, he cared about the principle. That little nobody had dared to exist in his presence without the appropriate level of deference. She hadn't grovelled, she hadn't cowered, she had looked him in the eye. And for that, she had to be crushed. The slap had been a satisfying appetizer. Her complete and utter ruin would be the main course. He walked to his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the glittering sprawl of Manhattan. The city was his kingdom, a collection of assets and pawns. He was a king, and kings were never wrong. He felt a vibration in his pocket and pulled out his phone. It was the valet from Aurelia. "Mr. Finch, sir, I am so sorry to bother you," the young man stammered. "But, when I was parking your car, your coat slipped off the seat, and well, something fell out of the pocket. I think it might be your watch, sir." Alistair Finch went still. The scotch glass trembled in his hand. The watch. He had taken it off and slipped it into his coat pocket without thinking. In his haste to leave, his anger at the waitress for some imagined slight, he had forgotten. The entire scene, the accusation, the slap, the police, it was all based on a mistake. His mistake. A cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach, quickly replaced by a wave of irritation. It didn't matter. The girl was still a disrespectful little brat. She deserved a scare. He would just quietly retrieve the watch. No one needed to know. The charges would be dropped in a day or two, and she would have learned a valuable lesson about her place in the world. "Hold on to it. I'll have someone pick it up in the morning," Finch said, his voice cold and dismissive. He hung up before the valet could reply. He took a long swallow of his scotch, the expensive liquor doing little to calm the unease creeping up his spine. He dismissed it as a fleeting annoyance. He was Alistair Finch. There would be no consequences. He strode out of his building a few minutes later, heading for a late-night meeting he had almost forgotten. As he stepped onto the curb, a sleek black Bentley pulled up, the engine a low, predatory purr. He assumed it was his car service. But as the valet brought his own car around, he realized his mistake. The Bentley just sat there, idling. He paid it no mind. He was about to get into his car when he heard it. A sound, at first distant, then growing rapidly closer. The sound of dozens of engines, all perfectly synchronized. He looked up. At the far end of the street, a single black Cadillac Escalade turned the corner. Then another, and another. They fanned out, blocking the entire width of the avenue with militaristic precision. From the other direction, the same thing happened. A fleet of identical, blacked-out SUVs, their tinted windows reflecting the streetlights like obsidian eyes. They moved without haste, a silent, inexorable tide of gleaming black metal. Within 60 seconds, the entire block was sealed off. Traffic came to a dead stop. Car horns blared in protest, then fell silent as the sheer menace of the scene sank in. 100 black SUVs, they formed a perfect, impenetrable fortress around him and his car. Alistair Finch stood frozen on the sidewalk, the cold night air suddenly feeling like ice in his lungs. This wasn't the police, this wasn't corporate security. This was something else entirely, something organized, powerful, and terrifying. His heart began to pound a frantic, panicked rhythm against his ribs. The smug certainty he had worn like a suit of armor all night shattered into a million pieces. Doors opened in perfect unison. Men in sharp, dark suits emerged from the vehicles, their movements fluid and economical. They were not brutish thugs, they were soldiers. They formed a perimeter facing outward, their hands clasped behind their backs, their faces impassive. They ignored the gawking drivers and the people peering from their apartment windows. Their focus was entirely on the task at hand. Then the passenger door of the Escalade directly in front of him opened. A man stepped out. He was tall and lean, with silver hair at his temples and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb the light. He wore a tailored Brioni suit, but he moved with the coiled grace of a panther. He walked calmly, deliberately, toward Alistair Finch, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the pavement. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze level and unnervingly calm. "Alistair Finch," the man said. It was not a question. His voice was quiet, cultured, yet it carried an authority that cut through the city noise. "My name is Marco. We need to have a conversation about a young woman named Isabella Rossi." The name Isabella Rossi hung in the air between them, and for a moment Alistair Finch was merely confused. The name meant nothing to him. He only knew the waitress, the thief. "I don't know who you're talking about," he blustered, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Who the hell are you? This is harassment. I'm calling the police." He reached for his phone, but Marco made a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand. Two of the suited men materialized at Finch's sides, their presence overwhelming. One of them gently but with undeniable strength took the phone from his hand. "That will not be necessary," Marco said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "The police are otherwise occupied tonight. As for who I am, that is unimportant. What is important is who she is, the waitress, the young woman whose face you struck in a room full of people." Alistair's bravado began to crumble, replaced by a creeping visceral fear. This was not about a watch. This was about the slap. She was a thief. She stole nothing, Marco interrupted, his tone hardening just enough to send a shiver down Finch's spine. The item in question, a Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime, reference 6300G, was, in fact, in the pocket of your own overcoat. The valet at Aurelia found it not 10 minutes ago. A clumsy mistake, but one you were perfectly willing to let a young woman go to prison for, to avoid a moment of personal embarrassment. Every word was a hammer blow, dismantling Finch's reality. They knew. They knew about the watch being found. How could they possibly know that? The valet had called him on his private number. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He felt exposed, naked, his power and influence suddenly as flimsy as paper. "Who is she?" Finch whispered, the question he should have asked hours ago. Marco allowed a thin, cold smile to grace his lips. "You live in this city, Mr. Finch. You move in circles of power and wealth. You should know that there are certain families, certain names that command respect. Names that are tied to the very foundations of this city in ways that men like you, with your new money and loud suits, will never understand." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Her name is Isabella Rossi Costello." The second surname landed with the force of a physical blow. Costello. There was only one Costello family that mattered in New York. A name spoken in hushed tones in boardrooms and back alleys. A name synonymous with absolute, untouchable power that operated in the shadows, far beyond the reach of law or commerce. Don Lorenzo Costello, the Godfather, the last of the old-world titans, a man whose influence was a ghost story whispered to frighten ambitious rivals. Alistair Finch felt the blood drain from his face. His legs felt weak, and he thought he might be sick. The waitress, the quiet, invisible girl he had humiliated and struck, was the daughter of Lorenzo Costello. He had not just swatted a fly, he had poked a sleeping dragon in the eye. "Oh God," he breathed, the words catching in his throat. "I didn't know. I swear to God I had no idea." "Ignorance is not a defense, Mr. Finch. It is merely a confession of your own arrogance," Marco said, his eyes like chips of obsidian. "You saw a waitress, a nobody, a piece of furniture you could abuse for your own amusement. You did not see a person. You did not see a daughter. Don Costello values his daughter's happiness above all things. She wished for a normal life, to walk in the sun, away from the world she was born into. She chose to work, to earn her own way. An honorable choice. And you spat on it. You put your filthy hands on her." The quiet, cultured voice was gone, replaced by a low growl that promised violence. "The Don is a reasonable man. He believes in balance, an eye for an eye, but he is also a man of creative temperament. A simple beating would be too quick, too merciful. Your punishment must fit the crime. The crime was not the false accusation of theft. The crime was public humiliation. Therefore, your punishment will be public ruin." Finch started to babble, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate, pathetic stream. "I can pay. I'll give her anything. Money, a car, an apartment. I'll apologize. Please, just tell me what you want." Marco held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "Oh, you will pay, Mr. Finch, but not in the way you think. Your currency is meaningless to us." He began to lay out the terms, his voice once again calm and precise, like a surgeon detailing a complex and fatal procedure. "First, by sunrise tomorrow, the charges against Ms. Rossi will be dropped. You will issue a formal, written apology to her and to the management of Aurelia, taking full responsibility for your drunken and belligerent behavior. You will state that you found the watch yourself and that Ms. Rossi was a model of professionalism and patience. Second, you will make a donation, an anonymous one, $20 million, to a charity of Ms. Rossi's choosing. The funds will be transferred to an account we provide by noon tomorrow. Third, and this is the most important part," Marco continued, a predatory gleam in his eye, "you will begin to find that your world shrinks. That lucrative tech merger you are negotiating, an anonymous tip to the SEC about insider trading, will mire it in investigations for years. The board members you have in your pocket, we have been made aware of certain indiscretions. They will find their loyalties shifting. Your supply chains in Asia will suddenly encounter unforeseen and catastrophic delays. The lines of credit you take for granted will dry up. Your friends will stop taking your calls. Your enemies will suddenly feel emboldened." Marco leaned in closer, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Within 6 months, you will be a pariah. Within a year, you will be bankrupt. You will lose your penthouse, your cars, your company. You will have nothing left but the memory of this night, the memory of the moment you decided to slap the wrong girl. We will not touch a hair on your head. We will simply erase you." Alistair Finch stared at him, his mouth agape, a silent scream trapped in his throat. This was a death sentence. delivered on a quiet Manhattan street corner surrounded by 100 silent witnesses in black SUVs. It was a complete and total annihilation, orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. He looked around wildly, at the impassive faces of the men, at the cold, dark windows of the cars. There was no escape. He was a fly caught in an invisible, unbreakable web. He had built an empire of ones and zeros, but here, in the real world, he had run afoul of a power that was ancient, elemental, and absolute. The billionaire screamed then, a raw, ragged sound of pure terror that was swallowed by the indifferent city night. The metallic click of the cell door opening was the loudest sound Isabella had heard in hours. She looked up, her eyes gritty from exhaustion and unshed tears, expecting to be led back to the interrogation room. Instead, a uniformed officer stood there, his expression unreadable. "You're free to go, Ms. Rossi. Your lawyer is here." "My lawyer?" she asked, confused. She hadn't been allowed her phone call. She hadn't had a chance to contact anyone. The officer just gestured down the hallway. Isabella walked on unsteady legs, her wrists raw where the handcuffs had been. Waiting for her in the precinct's drab reception area was not some harried public defender, but a man she knew all too well. Antonio, a man who had been a fixture in her life for as long as she could remember. He was her father's consigliere, his most trusted advisor. A quiet, unassuming man who always seemed to be observing from the corners of rooms, his gentle eyes missing nothing. He was the old man from the restaurant. "Antonio," she breathed, her voice filled with disbelief. He gave her a small, sad smile. "Isabella, it is good to see you are unharmed." He held her coat for her, his movements calm and reassuring. "Come, there is a car waiting." She allowed him to guide her out into the pre-dawn chill. The city was quiet, washed in the grey light that precedes the sunrise. A single black sedan, not one of the menacing SUVs from the night's blockade, was parked at the curb. Marco stood beside it, his posture relaxed now, the predator at rest. He opened the rear door for her. "Ms. Rossi," he said, his voice respectful, "I apologize for the delay. There were some formalities to observe." Isabella slid into the plush leather seat, the sheer surreality of the situation washing over her. Antonio sat beside her. The car pulled away from the curb, gliding silently through the empty streets. "What happened?" she finally asked, her voice small. "They were going to charge me. That man, Finch." "Mr. Finch has had a change of heart," Antonio said gently. "He has seen the error of his ways. He has dropped all charges and will be issuing a full public apology for his behavior." Isabella looked from Antonio's kind, wrinkled face to the back of Marco's head. She knew there was more to it. Much more. "You were there at the restaurant," she said to Antonio. "I saw you." "Your father worries," he replied simply. "He respects your desire for independence, but he does not trust the world to be kind to you. He asked me to watch over you from a distance." The gilded cage. Even when she thought she had flown free, its shadow had followed her. A part of her bristled at the overprotectiveness, but a larger, more honest part of her was flooded with a profound sense of relief and gratitude. She had been drowning, and a hand had reached down from a world she was trying to escape to pull her to safety. "And Finch?" she pressed. "What did you do to him?" Marco's voice came from the front seat, low and even. "We simply explained the situation to him. We outlined the consequences of his actions and offered him an alternative path. He was receptive." Isabella knew Marco's definition of receptive was likely very different from the dictionaries. She pictured the scene from the crime shows her father loved to watch. But she also knew they wouldn't tell her the details. It was not her world. Not by choice. The car stopped not at her small apartment in Queens, but in front of a stately brownstone in a quiet, tree-lined street in Brooklyn Heights. Her father's home. Antonio led her inside. The house was quiet, but a light was on in the library. Don Lorenzo Costello stood by the fireplace, a small glass of anisette in his hand. He was not the hulking caricature of a mob boss from the movies. He was a man of medium height, with thoughtful eyes and hands that were surprisingly delicate. He looked more like a university professor than the most powerful man in the New York underworld. He turned as she entered, and his face, usually a mask of calm control, softened with relief and love. "Isabella," he said, his voice a warm baritone. He opened his arms, and she walked into his embrace, finally letting the tears fall. He held her, stroking her hair, murmuring in Italian until her sobs subsided. "I'm sorry, Papa," she whispered against his chest. "I tried. I just wanted to be normal." He held her at arm's length, his thumb gently brushing the fading mark on her cheek. His eyes hardened for a fraction of a second, a glimpse of the steel beneath the velvet before softening again. "A lioness does not need to prove she can hunt with the mice, Maya cara," he said softly, "but I am proud you tried. You have a strong heart, stronger than you know. This world, it did not deserve your service," he sighed. "But you are my daughter, and no one touches what is mine." He explained what Marco had laid out for Finch, the public apology, the financial ruin, the complete dismantling of his life. And the $20 million donation. "It is your money now, Isabella," her father said, "a fine for his disrespect. You may do with it as you wish. Buy art, travel the world, fund your museum." Isabella listened, the exhaustion of the night warring with the cold fury that was beginning to solidify in her core. She walked to the window, looking out at the waking city. "Your plan will bankrupt him, Papa. It will make him a ghost on Wall Street. But a man like Finch doesn't fear being poor. He fears being insignificant. He fears being seen as a fool." She turned back, a new light in her eyes. "Your way will break his fortune. But his true wealth, the thing he values most, is his reputation. His ego. I want to break him." A flicker of surprise, then profound respect, dawned in Lorenzo's eyes. He gestured to a chair. "Tell me." He presented himself as a man of culture. He judged me for my cheap dress. He built his entire public persona on being this new money Medici, a patron of the arts. Her voice was low, controlled. "I want to show the world he is the cheap one, a fraud with a good tailor." She looked at Antonio, who had entered the room with a tray of coffee. "Antonio, can you get me everything there is to know about his art collection? Every auction record, every provenance report, every appraisal." Antonio nodded slowly, a thin smile touching his lips. "It will be done." He then added, a twinkle in his eye, "In fact, it already has been." Isabella looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "This man, Finch," Antonio explained, setting the tray down, "he has been a nuisance for some time, trying to buy influence in city politics, stepping on the toes of our associates. Your father asked me to compile a file on him weeks ago, looking for a weakness. A lever." He tapped his temple. "His greatest weakness is his vanity. He buys art not because he loves it, but because he wants to own it. He pays for the name, not the quality. He is easily fooled by a good story and a high price tag. We already suspected much of his collection was questionable." The revelation was stunning. Her ordeal hadn't been the start of this. It had merely been the catalyst. Finch had been a marked man long before he ever walked into Aurelia. He had just chosen the worst possible way to get their attention. "So you have a file?" Isabella asked, her mind racing. "A very thick one," Lorenzo confirmed, a predatory smile on his lips. "We were merely waiting for the right moment to use it. You, my daughter, have provided that moment. Now the weapon is yours. How do you wish to aim it?" For the next 2 weeks, the library became Isabella's war room. She didn't sleep, she barely ate. Fueled by coffee and a cold, righteous anger, she and Antonio dissected Alistair Finch's life, laid bare in stacks of documents. She cross-referenced auction catalogues from Sotheby's with obscure European gallery manifests. She analysed pigment reports and X-ray scans of canvases. She read the breathless society columns praising Finch's acquisitions and saw, with her trained eye, the boasts of a man who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. The student who had wanted to curate a museum was now curating a man's downfall. The day of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's annual Benefactors Gala arrived. That morning, Alistair Finch stood before a podium, 100 cameras flashing in his face. He was a ghost of his former self. His suit, though still expensive, hung on a frame that had lost £20. His hands trembled as he held the prepared statement. He read the apology in a monotone, his voice cracking as he admitted to his deplorable and drunken behavior and exonerated the completely innocent and professional Isabella Rossi. It was a public crucifixion, and he was nailing himself to the cross. He was ruined financially, his empire collapsing under the invisible, relentless pressure her father had applied. But this public humiliation was the salt in the wound. That evening he attended the gala out of sheer foolish pride, a captain determined to go down with his ship. He was a pariah. The air around him was a vacuum. People parted before him, their conversations dying only to reignite in hushed whispers once he had passed. He clutched a champagne flute, his knuckles white, a rictus of a smile plastered on his face. And then he saw her. Isabella was not wearing a waitress's apron. She wore a deep emerald gown that shimmered under the chandeliers. Her hair swept up to reveal a simple, elegant diamond necklace. She was on the arm of her father, Don Lorenzo Costello, who was greeting the mayor with the quiet confidence of a man who owned half the city. When her eyes met Finch's across the crowded room, she didn't look triumphant or vengeful. She looked clinical. Like a surgeon regarding a tumor she was about to excise. She and her father made their way through the crowd, a path parting before them as if by magic. They stopped in front of the gala's centerpiece, a newly unveiled sculpture on loan from a private collector. The Weeping Faun, attributed to a lesser-known Renaissance master. A plaque beside it read, "From the collection of Alistair Finch." "A beautiful piece," Don Lorenzo commented, his voice carrying in the sudden lull of conversation around them. Finch puffed up his chest, a pathetic attempt to reclaim some dignity. "It's the cornerstone of my collection," he announced, his voice a little too loud. "A masterpiece of emotional depth. The provenance is impeccable." Isabella stepped forward, her gaze not on Finch, but on the sculpture. "It's a fake," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and calm, and it cut through the room like a scalpel. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Finch's face went from pale to a blotchy, furious red. "How dare you?" he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "You're a waitress. What would you possibly know about Quattrocento sculpture?" Isabella ignored the insult, her focus remaining on the marble. "I know that the supposed artist, Bartolomeo Bellano, was a student of Donatello's. His authentic works show a clear, almost reverent imitation of his master's style. Softer lines, a focus on naturalistic posture." She gestured to the statue. "This faun is overwrought, far too dramatic. The pathos is forced. It's a caricature of Renaissance emotion." A murmur went through the assembled patrons. They were listening now, captivated. "But aesthetics can be debated," Isabella continued, her tone as even as a lecturer's. She pointed to a fold in the faun's marble drapery, her finger steady. "Technique cannot. I know that Bellano died in 1496, and I know that particular style of drill work, the deep uniform channels used to create that shadow, wasn't developed until Bernini perfected it in the 1620s. Over a century later." She then gestured to the base. "Furthermore, the quarry marks on the marble are from Carrara, yes, but from a section of the quarry that geological surveys show was inaccessible until the late 18th century. It's a masterful forgery, probably from the 1920s, when this sort of thing was all the rage among new American millionaires who didn't know any better." She finally turned her gaze on him, her eyes cold and merciless. "It is as hollow and as desperate for legitimacy as the man who owns it." Silence, a profound, suffocating silence descended on the grand hall. The museum's chief curator, a man with a formidable reputation, hurried over, a magnifying glass appearing in his hand as if from nowhere. He stared at the drill work, then at the base, his face paling. He didn't need to say a word. Everyone in the room saw the truth in his horrified expression. He knew instantly that she was right. Every eye in the room turned to Finch. He was no longer a fallen titan. He was a joke, a fraud who had been publicly dismantled, not by a rival billionaire or a corporate raider, but by the waitress he had slapped, using knowledge as her weapon. His arrogance had led him to build a house of cards, and she had just calmly, expertly, pulled out the one at the bottom. He didn't scream or rage. He simply made a small, strangled sound, turned, and walked away. His shadow slinking behind him, erased from the world that mattered to him most. Don Lorenzo placed a proud hand on his daughter's shoulder. "That," he said quietly, for her ears only, "is how a Costello settles a debt." Later, in the car gliding through the quiet park, Lorenzo looked at his daughter. The fury that had animated her for weeks had been replaced by a serene calm. "Antonio told me something interesting," he said. "The dealer who sold Finch that sculpture and 3 other major pieces in his collection. A man named Silas Croft. Antonio has been aware of Mr. Croft for some time. He sells beautiful stories to men with more money than sense." Isabella looked at her father, understanding dawning. You knew his collection was full of fakes long before that night." "We knew he was a fool," Lorenzo corrected gently. "A vain, arrogant fool who built his reputation on things he didn't understand. We knew that one day his own ignorance would be his undoing. We simply had to wait for him to provide the stage." His hand covered hers. "He chose you as his victim, and in doing so, he chose you as his executioner. You did not just use the weapon we gave you, Isabella. You sharpened it." A month later, Isabella stood in the dining room of what was once Aurelia. It was now Il Rifugio, the refuge. She had used Finch's fine to buy it. The rest of the money had endowed a foundation, managed by the sharpest lawyers her father knew, offering legal aid and emergency grants to service workers facing harassment or unjust termination. The foundation's first successful case had been against a hotel manager who had fired a housekeeper on a false accusation. The manager was fired, the housekeeper was reinstated with back pay and a public apology. Mr. Dubois, now her general manager, approached with a smile. "Everything is ready for opening night, Isabella." "It's perfect, Jean-Paul," she said. She walked to table 7, the prime alcove, and looked out at the park. She had tried to escape her father's world, seeking a life defined by quiet study and simple work. But that night, Alistair Finch had taught her a valuable lesson. You could not hide from the world's cruelty. You had to face it, but not with brute force. You had to find the cracks in your enemy's armor, the hollow spaces in their pride, and press with precision. She was no longer a bird in a gilded cage, nor a mouse hiding from lions. She had found a way to be both the scholar and the soldier, the curator and the queen. The gentle clinking of silverware began as the first guests arrived, the sound a familiar heartbeat, but one that now beat to a rhythm of justice she had composed herself.